I'm Joan Coyle, and I chair this committee. I'm going to still call it a committee. And I want to point out to you that on the bio sheets at the back of this document we gave you is everybody's Twitter handle for our guests and our speakers. Now, as somebody who helped plan this, we've really been excited about it. First panel was wonderful. I think you'll agree with me. But now the second panel on truth, trust, and telling stories is going to be out of this world. Trust me, it's going to exceed expectations. So it's my pleasure to introduce Tom McMahon, an MPC board member and the Vice President of Advocacy and Public Affairs with the Association for Unmanned Vehicle Systems International. Tom McMahon.
Thank you, Joan. Appreciate it very much. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Joan, for setting the bar very high, but I'm sure that we will meet it. We have a great panel here for you this morning, and I'd like to quickly introduce all of them. Sitting here to my right, we have from Scripps News Washington Bureau, Mark Greenblatt. Mark is a senior national investigative correspondent for Scripps. Next to him is Emily Horn. She's a head of global public policy communications at Twitter. Has been on the job for 4 months there at Twitter. As you'll see from her bio, she formerly worked in the federal government, so jumping one fire to the next. And then next to her is Katerina Matsa. She's senior researcher of journalism research at Pew. And then on the far end of the table is Richard Levick. He's a president and CEO of Levick Strategic. As Joan mentioned, more of their bios are on your tables in the program for today. Each panelist will take a few minutes to provide some opening remarks about truth, justice. Oh, excuse me, that's that's Superman. Truth, justice, the American way. But today we're going to talk about trust, truth, and telling stories. And so each panelist will take a few minutes to give us some opening remarks. And then, as you saw in the last panel, we have some wireless mics and some roving folks with those mics who will come to your table and you can ask your question. Also, as Lindsay had mentioned earlier, please continue to work on your social media here and get the word out to beyond the walls here of the National Press Club. Let them know what we're doing this morning. The Twitter handles are in your program as well. And also, please use the hashtag NPCLive. So to get things started, Kat, let's go with you. And you have some very eye-opening research on the views of Americans about digital media and how they consume it. So over to you.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? Okay, just making sure. So I thought I would start with some data on certain developments. I would focus on 3 areas that we've seen a lot of change in the past couple of years. So starting with misinformation, which I know it's part of the panel, and what we would like to discuss. Right after the election, we fielded a survey asking Americans, their views about misinformation, fabricated news online. So what we found was that 64% of Americans consider that made-up news, fabricated news, has caused a great deal of confusion about basic facts of, everyday basic facts. So I like to show this slide because it's one of the things that sometimes there are a lot of questions like, do Americans notice? Do they care? And from what we see when we ask this question, we see that the made-up news and fabricated news are creating confusion. So we also asked whether, they're seeing 2 types of fabrications or misinformation, whether they see completely made-up news or are they seeing misinformation, like not fully accurate news. And from what you can see is that a lot of, there's an extensive part of the public that sees misinformation. So 51% often sees not fully accurate news online. So another element, so I like to show you these first 2 slides when it comes to misinformation, but kind of like trying to work through what are the elements in the context of what is happening. How did we reach this era of discussion about misinformation? A lot of the work that we've done since 2014 has focused on polarization and divisions in America. And part of our work in the journalism project at the center has been understanding media choices and how polarization and divisions, partisan divisions many times, play into media choices and attitudes towards the media. So this is a slide that I always like to show because it shows this division. And as you see, for the first time in 2017, this is from this past spring, this is the widest gap that we've seen between Republicans and Democrats when it comes to the support of the media's what we call watchdog role. So the way we ask the question is basically whether people believe that criticism from news organizations keeps political leaders from doing things that they shouldn't be done. And as you see, an overwhelming majority of Democrats believe that they support that statement, while only 42% of Republicans do so. And this is the widest gap that we've seen since we've been tracking this question since the 80s. And of course, as you see, there's some temperamental, like ups and downs depending on who is in charge and who is the president. So that kind of flips every time, but we've never seen that kind of gap. And that actually confirms a lot of the research we've seen since 2014 when it comes to the choices and the media choices also that people turn to. A lot of the times, the media diets, as we would say, of Republicans and Democrats are very, very different. They concentrate and they go to very different sources when it comes to information and news. And that difference, I like to show always the first slide because it's the widest gap, but that carries through actually 4 key media attitude questions that we asked. And you'll see the first one is the one that I just described, that has a 47-point gap, but that carries through about, favoring one side, trustworthiness, whether people are being kept well informed, and you see how far Democrats are from Republicans, and vice versa. Also, that plays into the views about the media as an institution. And this is another way of asking this question, whether these institutions that I'm showing here have a negative effect of how things are going in the country. And national media is quite high. As you see, though, the partisan divide is also here. So you'll see for the national media how Republicans are more likely than Democrats to believe that the national media have a negative effect. Finally, the third element that I wanted to discuss today is digital. And I think it's very important, we've seen it from our research, how it connects to misinformation and how the experience of news online has changed from what it used to be 10 years ago or 20 years ago. So, for instance, just in 1 year, we asked this question about specific social networking sites, including Twitter. And even though it's a modest increase, it's still an increase. We've been tracking this question and asking about news usage and news consumption on social media for a while now. You see that now it's at 67%. And a lot of that growth actually this year came from older Americans and lower education, and those Americans that they have lower education, which is also a big change from what we've been seeing, that usually it was the young, the more highly educated, white people. Today, it's more non-whites, lower education, and older Americans, and that was a change from last year. And this is like more of like a more detailed presentation of each social networking site. The big difference this year was YouTube, that increased pretty significantly in terms of like their reach for news. The second part of the digital news experience, as I said, is mobile. And we've also been tracking that for a while now. You see we have the trend since 2013. For the first time this year, mobile news consumption is on par with desktop news consumption, which is showing this kind of like difference again, like we having basically phones on our hands and getting news there. And when we ask a follow-up question, what do you prefer, whether you prefer mobile or over desktop, 65% say they prefer mobile. So that's another element that plays into that. Finally, when it comes to trust, and I like to show trust here and not earlier because it plays into social media and misinformation, as we said, online. trust for social media is very, very low. And this is the second year we asked this question, and it continues. The trend is the same. As you see, only 5% say they have a lot of trust on information that they get from social media, when the percentages for national news organizations, local news organizations, and friends and family is quite higher than that. Finally, this is another question that I was talking about earlier about the partisan divisions, and speaks a bit to that ideological bubble in a way that we've discussed, or echo chamber, or some of the literature talks about that with that term. So in 2017, 40% of Americans said that information and news that they get from friends and family posted online about political and social issues represent just one side. So this is it for me. I hope that I provided a lot of information and interesting insight to discuss.
That's great. Thanks, Kat. And is this also available on the Pew website if people want to go back later and see it, or
Yeah,
people
I'm happy
watching on
to
video?
share those, also the PowerPoint with anyone that wants. Please see me afterwards, and we can
Okay.
share that. Yeah.
Great. Well, thanks a
But
lot.
yeah,
We'll talk some
everything
more
is
about it.
published. though.
Okay,
Yes.
great. We'll talk some more about that. Thanks very much, Kat. So, Mark, let's go to you. Get your perspective as someone who's on the beat every day as a TV news reporter here in Washington.
So first of all, thank you, and I'm blown away by some of the statistics. I haven't seen some of those things. They're really eye-opening. You know, one of the things that I'm so grateful for this morning is to be able to sit in a room full of brand builders in an era when the media has been under attack. I think it's fair to say, enemy of the people, opposition party, reporters, people just like me have been labeled. So I thought that I would do something that I think is more and more and more important that we all do as reporters, as communicators, and that is just to be transparent and open. And I'd give you a short bit about why it is that I got into becoming an investigative reporter. The shortest version is that when I was back at the University of Missouri many years ago in their School of Journalism, I once was a sports reporter, and I happened to fill in for a friend of mine who was hungover, who was a news reporter, and he couldn't make his shift that day. And I sort of fell in for him, and I ended up getting assigned a story that had to do with the Children's Miracle Network. I ended up telling the story in a little bit of a different way than many people would have looked at the piece. And I pulled on a Sunday afternoon the head of the local chapter off of a treadmill in a local gym, and I said, look, I really need to put a face on this story. I need to do it immediately. I don't have time to delay. We did the story about a young girl named Cassidy Davis, either 6 or 8 years old at the time. She was dying of cystic fibrosis. And at the end of the day, I don't think I was even 20 years old at the time. This was for the NBC affiliate in mid-Missouri. At the end of the day, after the story aired, that I knew was done in a little bit of a different way than others would have done it, I watched the phone started ringing. The phone started ringing because people wanted to help this young girl. And what that taught me back in the day when I was on my way to becoming a sports broadcaster was that the power of what we can do when we're at our best in journalism is extraordinary. We can change lives, we can help people. And that's why I was inspired. I got addicted, in fact, to that, and I just learned to get the skills that I needed in order to try to, this sounds quite idealistic, to change the world a little bit, make it a little bit of a better place, a positive place. So this past year has been quite an eye-opener in that folks like me have been decried as the enemy of the people. That's been hard to listen to, and I want to fast forward a little bit in that I got sort of a front row seat to some of what's going on, in that there was an invitation that came through in February from the White House. And the invitation was right at a time when I think the White House was at extreme odds with New York Times, ABC News, NBC, sort of name it, Washington Post. And the White House decided they wanted to do a reach out, public relations reach out to sort of a select group of regional and local reporters. My company, Scripps, owns a number of television stations around the country, and so I'm based in Washington for them, and I report for all of them, and I was invited to the dinner. And so I got to meet the president, the first lady, the vice president. Sean Spicer sat down at dinner time, Kellyanne Conway, essentially the entire crew, other than I think Steve Bannon. But other than that, everybody was there. And how that evening went, which I think informs sort of where we stand in many ways, at least out of the DC spectrum, is when the president came around and introduced himself, he shook all of our hands. He was very cordial and actually quite charming in person. He takes up the room. We're having dinner in the state dining room, by the way, of the White House. And there's 18 reporters and then all of these people. And we're underneath this painting of Abraham Lincoln looking down upon us, and it's quite, all the trappings of power and charm and prestige are all around us. And what the president did as he walked around and spoke to all of us was he made it a very big point to talk about all of the good reporters, in his view, that were doing good stories about him. And I'm not going to name any names here in public and on the record, but there were definitely a couple of people in the room that night that he was quite friendly with, and made it a big point to make sure that there were pictures taken with him and the First Lady. And the signal that was clearly sent to someone like me, who's truly attempting to be very bipartisan in my reports. I hold this crazy ideal that no matter who's in power, a little bit of a check on that power is a healthy thing, whether you're a Democrat or a Republican. And I've been very true to that. Leading up into the election, we did stories on Clinton, we did stories on Trump. The message that was clearly sent was that if you're doing positive stories in this era on the White House, we're going to put our arm around you, we're going to give you access, we're going to, we're going to make you our friend, and if you're going to challenge us, well, I think you've seen sort of what happens, and it can get it's very challenging to watch. And so I would just close with this before we open it up for discussion, and that, despite whatever my ideals are in what I want to be as a reporter and what I know many very good colleagues aspire to be, we're all human beings and we all make mistakes. When we make mistakes, I think it's extremely important that we own up to them publicly and transparently. The panel today is about truth, and I think we need to sort of be very, very hard on ourselves, especially in an era like right now, because one mistake you can be branded, very, very. You can have a large platform talking about what that mistake can be, and the one thing that I hope we can get past is sort of if they're in the instances where a journalist makes a mistake, maybe they aren't as fair as they should be. I think we all know that happens occasionally, maybe more than occasionally. I think that what we need to do is we need to sort of come together and say, well, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're actually trying to tear down America. And my hope and my aspiration is that we, as reporters, as communicators, that we are that we try to be truthful, that we are truthful to the best that we can, that we're fair, and that we're as transparent about our process of how we get information, and maybe perhaps we become more transparent. Maybe perhaps we have to put out, these are all the steps that we've taken in order to try to get to the other side of a story. But I think that there's a lot of room to talk about, perhaps in truth and being very, very transparent about who we are, what we do, what our goals are, and why we're communicating what we are.
Great. Thanks, Mark. Now let's move over to Emily and get the view from Twitter.
Thanks. It's great to be here, and thank you everyone for coming out today. Looking forward to a very robust discussion. I might borrow your framework here and start with a bit of a personal anecdote about how I came to be in this field. I grew up in Ann Arbor, Michigan in the 90s, and one of the formative experiences that really shaped me was when the Ku Klux Klan came to our very liberal enclave to hold a rally in the summer of 1996. And you may remember this. There was a picture that became famous out of that rally where an African-American woman named Keisha Thomas her photograph was snapped as she was cradling a Klan member who had been attacked by counter-protesters in the march. And it stuck with me. I was at I was impressionable age. I was a teenager. I was horrified that this was happening in my hometown. And I was fascinated to watch the media swirl around it, and really extraordinarily impressed to see that what came to define that day was actually an image of counter-protest and an image of humanity and people reaching beyond the immediate challenge in front of them to find something to connect with. In this case, this young woman expressing sympathy for and empathy for even someone who had shown up to protest an abstract ideal. She was able to connect to his humanity. And I think that the inspiration of that moment and the effect that it had on so many people really inspired me to pursue a career in essentially how our stories made, how our narratives made, what are the elements that emerge in the heat of the moment that define how we remember a particular experience. I got into that work in academia and did a master's in history, and then quite through a series of internship accidents and security clearance shenanigans, found myself working at the State Department, which was not always a goal of mine, but once I landed there, I realized, oh, this is a wonderful place, and I have a tremendous opportunity to not only work with one of the best press corps in Washington, the State Department beat reporters who cover that institution, do so with extraordinary depth of knowledge, with extraordinary commitment to a very difficult beat, and they do wonderful work every day, and it was a privilege and an honor to help them in their work. But also working at State gave me a platform to go out into the world and work in communities where we don't have a First Amendment and where freedom of speech, freedom of expression, freedom of a free press are not embraced in the same way that they are in the United States, even when we go through our own challenges to some of those ideals. So I got to spend a lot of time in South and Central Asia, which was my beat at State for a long time, working with a range of actors, everyone from a very vibrant, dynamic press in India, all the way to states in Central Asia where there is no such thing as a free press in some of them. It was an honor to work with those communities and to help them try to build capacity among journalists, whatever the challenges they may have had, whether it was simple journalism training exercises. How do you develop a beat? How do you work with sources? How do you try to speak truth to power, given the limited platform that you may have? Supporting them through training, supporting them through outreach, and trying to build relationships. Always mindful that while doing so, I was there as a representative of the United States government, and that carried with it its own attendant responsibilities. Since joining Twitter 4 months ago, I have been really fascinated to approach these same kinds of challenges, but from a little bit different perspective. I sometimes joke that working in comms and tech is kind of similar to working in comms and government. The verbs are the same, it's just the nouns that are a little bit different, I think is how I'd put it. But I really still enjoy very much working with reporters. Ultimately, at the end of the day, I think most of us are in this field because we believe in the power of a free press. We believe in their commitment. We strive to help them get the story right, even if we don't always agree with the end product. And I'm sure everyone here can find something to quibble with at some point. But at the end of the day, I think we're all here because we are storytellers and because we appreciate that we have an immense responsibility to try to get it right, to use the platforms that we have been given to be as transparent as we can be, to the best of our abilities, recognizing we all operate within particular constraints. And at the end of the day, that the journalists that we work with have, I truly believe, a sacred obligation to try to speak truth to power, to try to shed light on things that have been buried for too long, and to try to tell an accurate story. I appreciate that there are more and more challenges to doing that these days, and so I'm looking forward to a robust Q&A about how all of us can better support their efforts.
Okay, great, Emily. Look forward to hearing more from you, and we get the discussion going here. Richard, let's move over to you.
Well, we just realized that we both had lived in Ann Arbor, so we're going to talk about Ann Arbor for the rest of the time, and just please occupy yourselves. State Street Deli, we can, Zimmerman's always better, but a few things here. First of all, the opportunity to go last allows me to completely change my remarks, which I'm going to do, and then you're going to be polite enough not to notice how staggered and ADD they are. So thank you. I want to thank, of course, the panelists for such great remarks and being a part of this. And I also really want to thank the people who took the obstructed view seats behind the pillar here. I do hope you get extra dessert, because it's really nice of you to do that. There's a screen. Good, thank you. And that's Danny, who always likes to interrupt and make me feel uncomfortable while it's okay. We're in the same group therapy together, so it's okay. So if I can, let me riff off a couple remarks here. First of all, I think what Mark said is so critically important. First of all, we are in the nation's capital, which used to stand for all those things, both freedom and democracy and truth, justice in the American way. Ronald Reagan never took his coat off in the Oval Office because the office represented so much, and he understood soft power. Whether or not we agree with him, he understood the power of symbols and of symbols to do good. Two, we are in the National Press Building, where our first office was, because this is the epicenter and the life center where communications for the United States, certainly on public affairs and issues of state, emanate from. And three, we are in the First Amendment room. And as a former professor of the politics of US constitutional law, I can only tell you that one of the things that separates us between order and chaos, why we stop at traffic lights, knowing that there's not a police officer at every corner, is our voluntary desire to participate in a democracy. So I think this is quite extraordinary. And for the press, the fourth estate, to be under threat, prior restraint, one might argue, to those people who put their lives at jeopardy to get us information is, I think, absolutely wrong, and I think we all owe a great debt to the journalist, and Mark, to you, and to social media, and to all those who work so hard to allow us to participate. The fact that we don't always choose to be well-informed is what we need to look at when we look in the mirror in terms of our role in a democracy. So let me say a few things. Also, I can't tell you, when you listen to the Pew data, how troubling it is. And I think that when you look at the separation, understand that we are now communicating into a level of anger that none of us have probably seen. It's probably more severe than between 1968 and 1972, the height of the anti-war movement. It's not yet reached on the spectrum where we were in 1856 to 1860. For those of you who haven't studied American history, the Civil War begins thereafter. I know there are some people living not far from here on Pennsylvania Avenue that would be news to, but that we do, in fact, we have this level of anger. And when you have those levels of anger, we do not have receptors of trust, which we all grew up and were used to. We had time to communicate. We don't. Our words were understood. What's happened historically when we look at that is sometimes I fear that Charlottesville, is it Kristallnacht or is it the Night of the Long Knives? One of those two moments in spectrum where things start to change dramatically, as it did in Germany in a democracy. So I think we're living in extraordinary times. You know, I've been at this for 40 years. My job is to go around the world, whether it's in Asia, and communicate with the Koreans and the threats to jables, the historically family-owned, publicly traded companies, or the Middle East dealing with post-9/11 issues, or the recent threats that exist between Qatar and the Emirates and Saudi. But to look at risk around the world and to be able to tell heads of states and companies what's likely to come next. And I think that what comes next for all of us is a great challenge. It's an extraordinary challenge and one that we have never had to face before. And it's going to require of all of us a greatness, a heroism. You know, I would, with Mark, you said, this is about truth. I don't think it's about truth. And that's the only thing I would disagree with you on, although very politely and only marginally and only as a lawyer could by taking just an inch. This is about speech. It is the ability for us, as Jefferson talked to the cure for speech is more speech. And I'm not sure if I believe that anymore, but I always have. I've always taught it. It is about our airing our differences without threat, the ability to communicate and find truth amongst the collective. And I think the fear that if we're talking about truth, it means that somehow mistakes are fake news. Mistakes are not fake news. Mistakes are human. And yet, for some reason, how untoward that we have to be on the defense for being something less than perfect. And let us speak for a moment about this fake news. Let us be very, very clear what it is. It is deliberate, it is malicious, it is manipulative, and it is no accident. 30 years ago, General Kasparov for the KGB wrote the Kasparov Doctrine. The Russian government then would proceed with experimenting with that in Soviet Georgia and Chechnya and the Ukraine, invading technologically elections, power grids. It is exactly, those experiments were to be used and to see how well they worked, and they worked well enough to use them here. Other presidents and other governments would have called what they did an act of war. I am not sure if it's an act of war, but it is certainly disruptive, and we are now having to deal with a battle we should not be fighting. I am not supposed to be partisan, and I'm ever with any government around the world, and I'm not trying to be partisan here, but I think that when the leader of the free world has a bully pulpit and looks at that threat and does not recognize it as such, we are all in jeopardy. It is as if Roosevelt after Pearl Harbor, Bush after 9/11 were to say, well, we'll look into this, but it's fake. It is not, it's a threat. I think as we proceed later, we will talk about, how do we deal with some of these issues, but in closing, I would say, I think what we're really here to talk about is epistemology, right? How is it that we get information? How is it that we get knowledge? And in keeping with what everyone said here, I think what's so true, not only is it polarization, we get our truth from whom we know, our tribe. That is, we trust information. People will say they don't trust Twitter. They don't trust social media. But what they do trust is when their friend forwards it to them, suddenly it goes from 5% to truth. And so we are now all tribal. And I think the fascinating thing about that is, if you look at advertisements, why is it that car companies, who are the most brilliant and with the exception of the US military, control most or provide most of the spending for television advertising, never talk about the facts of the car? It's all about the beautiful man, the beautiful woman, how you're going to feel, how sexy you're going to be when you drive that thing, and then after you take it home, you think, yeah, but I bought it for the airbags, right? Right? We have gone from conversation, which is content-based, to now advertising, which is all about the headline, how do we feel, the instant gratification. That's all advertising driven. And I don't mean that this is advertising. I mean it's the theme of advertising. It's the theory of advertising. So let me ask you a question in closing. Each of us are suffering from content shock. We receive 3,000 to 5,000 messages every single day. Can you remember 3 from yesterday? Is this when we get to the Socratic method, I get to call on you? Which 3 do you remember? We don't. We're overwhelmed with information. And so what do we do instead? We remember the headline, we remember how we feel, and we simply categorize, is it good or is it bad? And democracy, capitalism, requires a conversation.
Great, Richard. Well, thank you very much. As a reminder, if you're on social media, please use the hashtag NPC Live. I'm sure a lot of people are using Twitter today, so keep those messages going. I know, too, that there's probably a lot of questions out there, so if we have the roving mics ready, we'll go ahead and start seeing first if there are any questions from the audience. We have Danny, someone right down here in the front, so if you just bear with us, we'll get the microphone over to you. If you would, please identify yourself by name and what organization you are affiliated with. So we'll get that over to you here in just a second. So here we go with our first question for the panel.
Thank
please.
you all so much. I went to college with Mark, so. He looks good. That story he told? Yeah, we were all awesome at Mizzou. So, my question is specifically for you, Emily. After this event, my name's Francie Williamson. I work for the Stanley Foundation. We're a global policy think tank. And one of the things that we deal with is nuclear weapons policy. And after this event, I'm actually going to another event where we're talking about the threat of social media and nuclear weapons being used. Specifically concerns with the president and his use of your platform and the risks of accidental anything happening, him saying something and something happening. What I want to ask you is, I know you've only been there a short time, but is there any thought, and I know recently they said they're not going to ban the president from Twitter, but has there been any thought on the global policy outreach front of tamping down on any kind of violent rhetoric on the platform, and how would you go about doing that?
Sure. So a couple of things to unpack in there. First of all, on violent rhetoric, you all may have seen Wired yesterday had a story that had a letter that we had sent to members of our Trust and Safety Council, which is a body that we established in 2016 of external experts to advise us on issues of trust, safety, abuse, harassment, violence. This is a group of trusted folks who we often road test some ideas or potential new policies with before we roll them out publicly. And the letter leaked, and that's fine. We actually are really proud of some of the things that we are looking at to potentially refine and make more transparent how we apply our policies on things like non-consensual nudity, violent groups, violent imagery. A lot of those processes and policies are still being worked right now, so it would be probably inappropriate for me to get out too far ahead of them. But I think it's very fair to say that we know that these have been issues for a long time. We are always looking at ways that we can do better on tackling a number of challenges, ranging from abuse and harassment, which is the way that the company has tackled those issues in particular is one of the reasons that I personally was very proud to come on board to work. I think it takes brave leadership to stand up as our CEO did and as our leadership team did and say we have a problem and we're going to direct a lot of resources at fixing it because this has to be a number one priority for our company. All of us have dealt with crisis communications at some point or another in their careers, and so I think all of us know that that's fairly unusual, and as a communicator to have that kind of leadership from your team makes it a lot easier. One of the things we've also recently talked about is the idea of public interest and making more transparent the idea that newsworthiness and public interest are indeed factors for how we determine content staying or going on the platform. And I think the important thing there is that, as with so many things, context matters. There are a lot of reasons that go into how we decide to apply our rules and apply our policies. Context absolutely matters. Public interest absolutely matters. And as our leadership have said many times, newsworthiness is also a factor too. So I think I'll just leave it at that. But I would say that broadly on issues of abuse, harassment, violence, and updates to our policies on those, please do stay tuned. I know that we do take those issues very seriously. We're directing a lot of resources right now at making sure that we are thoughtful in the application of our policies and looking at ways that we can be more transparent in how we apply those policies.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. Another question that we have over here, the person from the National Restaurant Association.
I'm back again.
If you
So
please again identify yourself.
I'm
and what's your
Leslie. I'm
question?
with the National Restaurant Association. Let me preface this by saying I'm a big fan of the media. This is not by any shape or way a critique, but one of the issues I feel like that has at least somehow contributed to some of this issue is that as the 24-hour news cycle turns into a 24-second news cycle, there's this constant need to make sure you're the first, that you're getting all this information out, and you're seeing a lot of sources, or a lot of media sources, especially really trusted ones, turn into what I call single sourcers, meaning you get one blind quote, one blind comment from someone, and that can create an entire news cycle. And this actually just happened with me. A very short story. We had a bit of information about something that was coming out of the White House. I was the only person talking about it. I was doing it blindly. It was, background only, not attributable. I know there's certain outlets that will print that. And once they print that one story, then the other outlets that I've been talking to consider that the second source, even though in reality, I'm the only source. And I created an entire news cycle of stories in top tier national publications based solely on me as an unnamed source. And again, there is this issue of, the Russians and fake news and all of this, but I am curious as to if you think that impacts both the quality of news, but also to people's perception of the news industry.
Mark?
Everybody's looking at me. Let me answer that by, I've worked in a number of different news organizations. Before I was with Scripps, I was at ABC News, based out of New York as a national correspondent, and before that I was in local TV in Houston, working for 8 years for a very strong CBS affiliate there. The diversity of experience that I've had working in different organizations has taught me that there are very different cultures everywhere you go. The media does not exist as a singular thing. We're all very different news organizations. So the best I can do is tell you this. The best organizations that I've worked for have actual policies in place. Where I work now, that could not happen. I could not publish a story based off of one, off-the-record source. It couldn't happen without probably going up to the CEO to make a decision, and it would have to be quite extraordinary. So what should happen is that there ought to generally be two sources. They ought to be real and direct. You can't, our standard, the standard at ABC News, the standard at Scripps, is that you can't do that. You can't look at other news articles as a source. I love my colleagues in the media, but there are mistakes, and so I don't trust. Truly, I learn from what some of the smartest reporters that are out there, what they write. I learn from them. But I'll tell you, a conversation I had with a producer on my team just yesterday in our office was, hey, that one aspect of this story that we're working on right now, I really would love to include that in a future report. We need to match it, though. The conversation, what matching means is not reporting what Time Magazine or Newsweek wrote. It is literally getting it to a primary source, and that's the standard. And so what does that mean as communications professionals or as news consumers? There are different brands and different cultures. The best that I would advise you as clearly a top-tier communications professional would be figure out who you're talking to on background or off the record. Do you trust them? Do you trust their culture? Do you know their policy? You can ask them their policy, by the way. There's nothing wrong. And if they don't have an answer or they don't know what their policy is, you're a smart person. You can make what you will from that. If you were to talk to me on background or off the record, I could tell you exactly what our policy is. I could tell you exactly how you'd be treated, and I'd give you, and so you'd start learning both from individual relationships, they matter, but also institutional ones, and ask what the policy is. Would be my advice to anybody in this room. And if they can't give you a policy of how they handle on background, if they understand what that means, some people don't. And I would even I would encourage you with one last thing. I had a very different, reporting in Washington is fascinating. In that, I was working on a piece where we were dealing with travel expenses at federal agencies. And I remember going to one federal agency and asking their PR team for some comment. And they actually separated out their response to me in an email with a quote that I could use. It was like a one-sentence quote that I could use attributable to them. That was on the record. Then there was a background section. Then there was a deep background section. And I had to go and look up, well, what does deep background mean? And then what I found was that there are actually different definitions depending on who you talk to. And so I bring this out because having a clear understanding up front of exactly what it is, and do it up front, exactly what it is that you mean by background, deep background, off the record, on the record, get that clarity, and don't believe that just because the New York Times or Scripps or ABC treats you one way that somebody else will treat you the same way. That's the best I can offer.
If I may, just a couple of things I'd like to add. I did play the Darth Vader role earlier, so now I'll try and play the helpful. Here are a couple takeaways. So one is the rules have really, really changed. We went from largely two source to one source, quite ironically, over the blue dress that Hillary Clinton, Monica Lewinsky and Bill Clinton. It was, in fact, a magazine, a newspaper tabloid that served as a second source for the Washington Post on that story, and so we've reduced that. But, I mean no criticism of the Post. Their tagline, "Democracy dies in darkness," is among the most powerful beacons we have at this moment. But having said that, I also don't know, had Roe v. Wade been written today, I don't know how it would be written justices apart, because it's based on the penumbra of the Fourth Amendment, the expectation of privacy. I don't know if any of us have an expectation of privacy, and that's society writ large. But the key, I think the takeaway is 100% of us, 100% of us will be hacked. Now, I speak to a lot of boards, and when I do that, they all look at me and go, at least that doesn't include me. 100% of us are going to be hacked, which means there is no privacy. So if you don't want it known, don't write it down. And I know this is really easy to say, it's really, really hard to do. But understand, I think that we have to be thinking that there's going to be so much more transparency, no matter how fair or honest or reputable the journalists are. It's a very, very different world. And I think we're also thinking that because we have these tools, we can all use them. And so we have to be very thoughtful. And that includes, therefore, when we're developing the strategy on something, whether it's writ large or acute, think about what happens if this leaks, if this is transparent.
Great advice. Let's go back to the audience. So, do you have more questions we have for the panel? Again, down front here. And there's a microphone. Again, please identify yourself and what organization you're with.
Yeah, I'm Cedric Brown with Hager Sharp, a PR agency with education and health clients. You say, if you don't want it known, don't write it down. But isn't there an emphasis, and aren't we all talking about being transparent and being honest as a way to earn the trust of our audience and the media?
Cedric, it's a great question, and to come from a competitor feels great. So, but no, I think you're asking a really great question here. I'm going to go to Plato and Socrates, which said that the death of democracy is too much democracy. I don't know. I don't know where the line is. I will say this, for your firm, for ours, for all the firms, for all the agencies, for the Restaurant Association, we all do things that we want to be transparent, but at some point when? And our clients are hiring us, or our companies are directing us to figure out when that point is. It is not that we want things to be transparent from the very first moment. When I look at some of the issues in the Middle East, or when there's hacking, it is the information. Some of it's real, and some of it's fake, and people have a really difficult time determining this. With Hillary Clinton and her emails, has anyone heard about that issue? Okay, Hillary Clinton and her emails. A couple of interesting facts: no smoking guns. The State Department's emails were hacked, not Hillary's. Okay, but it's all Hillary. But with it, Hillary's trove. Okay, so why? Because it's all about the salaciousness. We're all interested in that. I call this the NASCAR presidency, right? We say we go for the race, but we stare at the accidents, right? If it weren't for the accidents, we'd call it traffic, right? It's all about seeing what's salacious. When Macron was hacked in France, what happened? For the next 2 days before the election, none of the media reported on it. But we're so much more interested in what's salacious, can be taken out of context, than in the fact that we've been hacked. And so I think that's a challenge for all of us too. But I don't think that your clients, I don't think that our clients want to be fully transparent instantly. They want to be, in any crisis, the Gulf oil spill, you want to gather the facts. You want to gather the facts first. And if I may, to be more helpful on this, I think a really important takeaway here is the collectivity. And that is, when you're dealing with a client matter, you have to have the collectivity of different groups and different people from different departments, HR, GR, government relations, communications, legal, talking, and coming up with the best solution in the war room. I do not want that transparent. Absolutely not. But what I want is, once we reach some level of understanding the truth, whatever truth is, then understand that going forward that we want to be as transparent as possible. Telling truth to power internally is the most challenging thing. At your agency, at my agency, I've got people here, I can tell you, as open as my door is, they're still going to be reluctant to say, Richard, you're wrong. We have to encourage that. And I know I'm not fully answering your question. I'm only saying that as we're trying to come to what our client's position is, I think that's important to be private, to encourage that kind of conversation. But then once we have our strategy, understand it's likely to be leaked.
If I may, just very quickly on that, I joked earlier, but it's actually completely true. The verbs are the same, and it's the nouns that are different. I see an extraordinary parallel in the work that I did when I was in government with some of the work that I do now that relates to private user information. At Twitter, our North Star has to be protecting the privacy and the safety of our users. And what that means for me as a communicator is that I often find myself in situations where if I know the truth about a particular situation. I know that someone is lying about being hacked and they actually did tweet out that thing they say they were hacked about. I know that someone is actually perpetuating behavior that they are saying they are experiencing. I have access to that truth, but as a communicator, I'm still bound by the responsibility to protect that information. I can't create a precedent wherein I would go out and comment on a particular account, even if it would be more convenient for me and my day-to-day work, and even if it would help in some ways maybe my company get a better narrative out there in the press, because we have to adhere to that North Star. And boy, I can't tell you how many times when I was in government, when we had, it would have been so much easier to say, actually, that American citizen just got really drunk and fell off the boat. They weren't pushed, and they're not responsible for that. But again, we had what was in government was called a Privacy Act waiver, and unless an American citizen signs a PAW, then a U.S. government representative cannot comment on their private information and what may or may not have happened to them in a particular context. Again, even if it's a story that would help ultimately the government try to be more accurate and try to explain the truth of a situation in a way that would probably benefit the government's narrative. That respect for privacy really does have to be a guiding principle, and it is ultimately about respect for the extraordinary amount of information that you have access to, the extraordinary amount of data. If you need to have those foundational values and let those guide your decision making on a day-to-day basis, even if it sometimes is frustrating, even if it sometimes doesn't lead to the outcome that would be most ideal for that situation. I find a lot of strength in that, actually, in adhering to that for those foundational values.
Okay, thanks, Emily. One question I'd like to ask of Kat, and it was going back to the study here. We talked here about the U of M, about Mizzou. I went to Auburn, War Eagle. But I saw in your study there about trust in college professors and universities. Can you tell us a little bit about that? Because Mark and I were talking before the panel started here, and we saw your study, and it seems that college professors seem to have, we always kind of looked at them for trust and for authority, and I know many of us over time have represented colleges and universities. We try to put them out there as experts. But can you tell us a little bit about sort of this reduction in trust among college professors?
Yeah, I'm a Georgetown alum, if that counts. And they're like
You'll have a football team? Oh, okay, sorry.
I don't
Just
know.
a
What
joke,
is that?
people. It's football season.
Do you mean soccer?
Yeah.
As a European, I can say that.
Touche.
Yes, so a lot of that trend, and I can put back the slide so you can all see. So it's here. So, I mean, as you see, that's actually the negative effect. So as you see, college and universities are actually much lower than the national media, banks and financial institutions, and labor unions. And if I remember correctly, this question asked, I think, for another couple, like other institutions. So it is quite low when it comes to negative effects. So Americans, in this case, view colleges and universities as having, on the other side, a positive effect on the way things are going in the country today. And as you see, though, still there is a partisan divide when it comes to college and university. So even though there is a consensus when you look at the numbers collectively when it comes to the partisan aspect of that specific question, there is still a divide there. I cannot explain why, people would see that because we didn't ask them about, but it does tie a lot on this, it's part of everything we've seen since 2014 that I've been working a lot on polarization and the media and institutions in this case of an increasing, distrust towards specific, especially the media, and polarization. So this is just part of the story of the bigger picture of looking at, not the news media, including now information from colleges and universities.
So still good to trot out the college professor to go on TV and talk about different issues. They have a lot of trust then.
I mean, I don't know about that, but I would say that we actually did have a study that it was published, I think, 2 weeks now it's been. We did a content analysis of stories from 24 outlets on for the first 100 days of the Trump administration. And one of the things that we saw there that was interesting was we tried to track sources, as we say, so the voices that they're being cited in news stories. And one of the things we found was that, for example, only 5% of the stories cited a citizen, which was a very, I don't know, as a researcher, sometimes you get into a research with hypotheses, it's low compared with the other voices that we saw in there. For example, Trump administration and the news media were the most widely cited sources. Experts was lower too. When it came to experts, issue groups, other types of sources were much lower than those two, the news media and Trump administration. So again, that's another indication of what it's been reported and what it's been cited on news stories.
Okay, great. Thanks a lot. Let's go back to the audience and see if there's any further questions that we have. Right back here in the back. Yes, sir. Again, please state your name and the affiliation you have.
Yeah, hi, I'm Luke Lambert with G&S Business Communications. And Richard, question for you. Good to see you again. It's been a while. You mentioned a broader societal problem, and you used the word tribe, because that's when you think about tribalism, it's people's desire to become part of smaller groups. So that would seem to be a real problem in society today. And I was just curious, I didn't know you were such a historian, so how could we take the positive aspects of that spirit and help it fix the problems that we're having? And how do you broaden that spirit of tribalism to modern society? And I was curious if you probably came across the book by Sebastian Junger on this very topic, which is pretty powerful.
I had the honor to speak with Sebastian at West Point some time ago, but not on this book. But I love the fact that you and Cedric got together and decided to ask the really hard questions. So I really appreciate that. Wow, let's see. So, I think we have, 3 minutes to get to how we overcome tribalism. I can think about, I can give lots of points about how we communicate effectively, and I mentioned that we have to blow up our silos, and we have to start thinking multidimensionally and start thinking the legal and the IR and the GR and all these issues, and that's really important to overcome it. But I'll give you some specifics in a moment, but at the end of the day, I don't really have a good answer to you for you. As a communicator versus an amateur historian, I think that there's a struggle here. Because when democracies have been tested this brutally, when we have been separated this significantly, it has not ended well. In our own country, in Germany, when we see these parallels, we've had to go off the edge first before we came back. I don't think it's any accident that Angela Merkel is now the head of the free world, and that our liberal society of the last 70 years, post-World War II, is being tested. So I don't know where it all goes. But as communicators, what can I suggest here? First of all, it's imperative that IR understand Washington better, that GR needs to understand Wall Street better, that lawyers need to understand communications, that communications need to understand legal, that we have to have this greater breadth. Why? Because we have to have these conversations that are communicating with different audiences. Two, we need to understand that we are in a revolution every bit as significant as the agricultural and industrial revolutions that have preceded it, but instead of calling an information revolution which it is, we call it a technology revolution, and we say, here, get me a 21-year-old with a Facebook strategy, or I'm sorry, a Twitter strategy.
Thanks for thinking I'm 21.
Right. Do I get any points for the setup? But we think of it. We think that we are in a technology revolution. We're not. We're in an information revolution, and with that means it's not how people get their information; it's how they share it. And with sharing, they think it's empowering. Where we are, we're refighting the election of 1800 between Adams and Jefferson, and what they were talking about was the difference between a republic and a democracy. We have spent our entire lives in a republic. That is, we knew the key reporters, we knew the financial analysts, we knew who the key members of Congress were or other staff committees, and that's how we dispensed information. Now we are in a hyper-democracy, and so we need to think differently. If we're going to be able to breach the tribes, we have to understand who the messenger is. We spend a lot of time on the message. Who's the messenger? Because that's who cuts through the clutter.
Great insight. Another question? over here.
Hi, Katerina. Lisa Warren, Pennsylvania State University. I teach effective writing, sometimes journalists. But my question for you today is regarding this research report. Was it originated from a microscopic or macroscopic perspective? And is this a social sciences question that you asked for the U.S. news landscape in digital polarized age? And then for Mark, what should we do to help unmuddy the waters for our students? Because they're very confused about the products that are available in news.
So, just to be clear, so this is a compilation of different studies. So this was not all like the data that I presented is not from just one, research report or study. This is research we've been doing the past year in different, increments in a way, or periods of the past year. So in a way, the way we usually operate is like trying to answer a research question. So it is a very social science perspective, the way we approach research. We are predominantly a quantitative research organization, so we approach things like, what is the research question? What are the key questions? For example, in journalism, that's my beat, that would like to tackle and understand. And then we apply the methods and we go on to do the research. A lot of the research that I've shown is surveys. I didn't include any of we do usually do content analysis too, in order to understand what the media, how they're covering, how coverage has changed and all that. So to answer your question of the macroscopic, microscopic, if I'm pronouncing that correctly, we usually try, so there are two kinds of research. Usually we have a plan that it could actually be over a year or 2 or 3, kind of like tackling one big issue or research area. For example, part of like the political divides that I was explaining, it's research that we've been doing since 2013, published in 2014 for the first time. So it's part of a bigger question that we've had. And folks in our politics division, for example, they've been tackling that question on the political side, understanding what are the divisions in other social issues, not the media. So this is more like a larger project. But for instance, when there are things happening in society, such as the misinformation discussion that was happening just before the election and during the election, was enough for us to understand that this is something we wanted to have some answers and understand what the public believes and views, and maybe get us started for something to think about for the next 6 months or a year as a starting point. So I think we do both in a way, but I would say, yeah, our main focus is like something that we design, we think very carefully, and we launch, and then could take up to 2-3 years even to tackle.
And Mark, what about the advice you have for consuming news?
To students.
To students, right.
Here's what I would say is I'm going to piggyback off of, I love this panel, and I'm going to piggyback off of Hughes' research again, and that divide that we just saw that we're at in America that has never perhaps been, we're at this sort of divide where the left and the right are so far away from each other, and where we've gotten into camps and tribes, as we've talked about here today. I'll tell you one thing that that an old journalism professor once did for me that changed the way that I consumed news years ago, and I think it's a great lesson to ask all of ourselves today. And he said, "What'd you eat for breakfast today?" And I sort of told him what I ate for breakfast, and he said, "Okay, now what was your news diet? What did you do this morning to learn about the world?" And he had me write it down. At the time, I was a young kid. ESPN was at the top, and and then there was a local news station that I was watching, and I think I may have read. I don't remember what newspaper it was. Maybe it was at the time. Maybe it was USA Today, something along those lines. It was quick. I was busy. And I immediately, just like thinking about what food I put into my body, I realized what I was putting into my mind to educate me about the world wasn't nearly as diverse as it needed to be. And so the lesson is one that I would challenge us all to do, which is that if we're in a camp, and we all are, we all have biases. There's no unbiased reporter. There's no unbiased communicator. We all have biases by the very nature of where we were born, who our parents were. Our jobs are to try to get as close to being as fair and accurate and in the middle and put those biases aside, being aware of them. So what I do intentionally is that I intentionally read and seek out the other news outlets that, pardon me, a little bit under the weather this morning. I intentionally seek out other news outlets that are saying things that are from other camps. And I read them, and oftentimes I find that they're writing very informative things. And by challenging ourselves to get out of our camps and intentionally read a diversity of opinions every day, and I don't mean like once a month, I mean get into the regular habit of it. And so if you like to read the New York Times, pick up the Wall Street Journal. If you like to, if you find yourself on the left, go read Breitbart. I'm not kidding, go read the Daily Caller. There's actually some interesting stuff that you might find. Now, you have to challenge yourself. If you're more on the right, you don't like the New York Times, well, you can still look at them skeptically, but read it. Be aware of what's being talked about. And that's the best advice I have. Create habits, daily habits, just as you would on eating healthy yogurt and working out. Get into good habits of consuming a diversity of news and intentionally check what is your news diet. That's my best.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, so we'll go to the back of the room here. Yes, ma'am.
Thank you. Speaking of biases, I guess I have to say who I am. I'm Alex Walker. I work with Families USA Healthcare Advocacy Group. Speaking of biases, we are facing a constant barrage of lies from the Trump administration on the issues and causes a lot of us work on. And I'm interested in what the panelists and others in the room have found effective in terms of countering that misinformation, because we know that certain types of communication just reinforces the lies, or reinforces the frame of, you can inadvertently reinforce the way the administration is framing your issue or your cause. I've been told that myths and facts is one of those examples, that it sort of reinforces the untruth. So how are people and organizations countering this in order to communicate the facts about their issues and causes?
Richard, you'd like to take that one, representing multiple clients around the world?
Oh, sure. That's good. Dan, did we raise therapy right after this? Because I'm going to need it. These questions are really great. So the question is, how is it that you battle the Trump administration when facts no longer work? Is that a good synopsis of the question? I think one, it's really interesting to see the arc of Trump's power from a Twitter point of view, and that is that for the last 2 weeks of the transition and the first week of the presidency, he had the ability to act as an axe. That is the ability to lower or raise stock with simply tweeting, and you saw that with some 13 different companies. By the end of the first week in office, what did he do? He had the Muslim ban, which was just again turned down for a second time by Maryland court this morning. Hawaii yesterday temporarily rejected. But what he did was he went too far. After that point, his individual tweets no longer had power. So I think it's really, really important to see which strategies work and which don't. 2, expect things to get worse, not better. And they're going to continue to do that. Remember, there's a direct link between Joe McCarthy and Donald Trump. That's Roy Cohn. Roy Cohn was McCarthy's chief legal counsel, and he was the mentor for Donald Trump on communications. So it's going to continue to get worse. 3, I had suggested earlier, who are your allies? It's critically important to have lots of allies and lots of voices. 4, and I think this is tragic, but I think one of the mistakes that Puerto Rico made was that they tried to play nice with the president. So that's why no one backed behind Mayor Cruz, and they are so concerned that if we offend the president, he's not going to let us have access to relief like Florida and Houston did. I think that's a mistake. I think that this is an administration that's a bully, and you treat a bully the way you always do. And but the way to do that, the way Puerto Rico should have done, was it's video. It's all about video. We can be biased, but it's really hard when we see pictures of human suffering. And I think David Gergen was right, in his day when he was counsel to 4 presidents, photo headline story. For us, it's the video. It's really, really important to get your pictures out there. And I mentioned it earlier, but that is, how can we communicate it in ways that tribes understand that? I always find it fascinating that people on one line of that divide say, I hate Obamacare, but I love the ACA. So I know that's a tremendous challenge for you. I will say this, because I think we're probably wrapping up. I think the most important thing we can do is risk mapping. And that is, you look at the risk, and this requires a big data dive with human intelligence, but you look at it ahead of time, because we no longer have time to react, we have to act. And that risk tells you what's likely to come next, who your allies might be, who your adversaries are, and I think that is a way to begin to build the third party voices. And remember, this administration only goes after companies and pharma. There's clearly, they're going after healthcare, but they only go after ones where they think they can win. How can we change that dynamic so it no longer looks like success?
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. It's been a very informative panel. Let's give a round of applause for our panelists. And so next on the agenda, we're going to take a quick break. We're going to go out here in the lobby, so feel free to mix and mingle and network with one another. Then we're going to turn the room around here for lunch and then hear from our keynote speaker and the president of the National Press Club. So thanks again for joining us, and we'll see you soon for lunch.